Welcome, everyone. My name is Eleanor, and I'm the archivist for the United Farmers Historical Society. And this presentation is on the United Farmers of Alberta 100 plus years of history. As I'm sure you can imagine, packing over a century of history into a 45-minute presentation is a bit of a feat. So consider this a broad overview. I've picked information and events that I found interesting from our archives and from my research, and I hope that you find it interesting as well. I will talk about the origins of the UFA, look at the United Farm Women of Alberta and Junior UFA, UFA's time as the provincial government, as well as their entry into commercial retailing for petroleum and farm supplies, and their expansion and growth from the 1960s to the present. And then I'll also talk a little bit about the United Farmers Historical Society and our archives. Okay. So by the early 1900s, cooperatives were not a new idea. Cooperatives are owned by their members who organized to meet common needs, such as securing access to products or services and maximizing the sale of their products or services. The reality for farmers was that equipment and supplies were expensive, so farmers worked together by combining their resources to get better deals on supplies and better prices for their commodities. In addition, farming conditions were coming more to the forefront, and issues such as drought, crop disease, barriers to banking and credit, and the hardship of rural living was becoming more apparent. Farmers realized that by banding together, they had a better chance to influence policy and pressure government to take notice of the issues that were important to them. Farmers in Alberta were seeing the rise of agrarian movements from the American Society of Equity, grain growers, as well as local organizations that had emerged, such as the Lacombe Cooperative Society and Edmonton Agricultural Society. Two of these movements, the Canadian Society of Equity and Alberta Farmers Association, amalgamated in 1909 to become the United Farmers of Alberta, a cooperative founded by farmers and ranchers to serve their needs. This move gave the UFA a stronger, more united voice for its members. The first executive of the UFA was George MacDonald, Avon Malecki, George Long, Thomas Balam, Rice Shepherd, E.J. Freem, and James Bauer of Red Deer, who became UFA's first president from 1909 to 1911. After the vote to amalgamate, which the majority of members voted in favor, came the decision on a new name. Having the word equity included in the name and logo was insisted by Canadian Society of Equity delegates who wanted to see a continuation of their aim and objective as an organization. It was Rice Shepherd, the new secretary, who shouted to the heavens, "I ask God to give us a name," and the name that came to me was the United Farmers of Alberta, our motto, equity. This became the organization's new name and motto, adopted at the 1909 meeting. The equity logo that you can see here is the first official logo, and it was used into the 1920s. It appeared on annual reports and letterhead during this time. Convention meetings became an annual occurrence. Pictured here is the 1910 meeting, which took place at the Mechanics Hall in Edmonton, and the 1911 meeting at Calgary City Hall. UFA members dressed in their finest attire to attend these events. In Deep Roots, UFA's Centennial History book, author Gord Tolton notes that the formality was for a reason. It was to show the world that these men were to be taken seriously and to meet politicians and businessmen on an equal level. At the 1910 convention, Premier Alexander Rutherford attended and congratulated the organization for gaining over 5,000 members. And at the 1911 convention, there were 260 members in attendance, representing every part of the province. The UFA was interested in a range of rural economic, social, and political issues. Early issues that were discussed at the meetings included hail insurance, hay trade, freight rate, pork monopolies, utility costs, railway infrastructure, and agricultural education. One issue in particular, which farmers had been asking for years, was better assistance with grain marketing. This prompted the UFA to become the driving force in the push for organized grain marketing. And in 1913, under the UFA's second president, William Tregillis, the Alberta Farmers Cooperative Elevator Company was formed to market the grain of its members. Within just 4 years, over 50 grain handling facilities were established. And in 1917, the Grain Growers Grain Company, which had been founded in 1906, and the Alberta Farmers Cooperative Elevator Company merged to become the United Grain Growers Limited. By 1920, UFA membership had grown to 30,000 members, and there were 1,200 locals throughout the province. Farmers had shown that they were organized. Locals worked to bring issues from the grassroots level to the central organization to be presented and voted on at annual conventions. If approved, the UFA would work to lobby the appropriate channels, such as government or business, in order to fulfill the demands of their locals. Also in 1920, the UFA's motto had expanded to become equal rights for all and special privileges to none. And they even had their own fight song titled Equal Rights for All. And so this is the page to the music sheet of their fight song. And if you're curious, the full lyrics are printed in our centennial history book, Deep Roots, that's available on our website. The UFA often used print literature to communicate their objectives to a wider audience and to increase their membership. On the left is an illustration showing the tree branches representing the benefits that come with having a strong and active UFA organization. And the roots are the various locals and associations that support these benefits. The images on the right are from a pamphlet detailing the aims of the organization, both politically and as a cooperative movement. And they include points such as improve the standard of country living and extend farmers' cooperative enterprises wherever practical and economical in the marketing of all farm products. Other points highlight strong support for education, community, and healthcare. In 1922 was the creation of the publication, the UFA, which acted as the organization's official organ. UFA President Henry Wisewood wrote the first editorial for the paper. In it, he says, "This paper will not deal extensively with the current news of the day. Most of the news of today will be dead and forgotten tomorrow, while a little truth learned today may live forever. We will not spend much time keeping ourselves informed of the mistakes of others, nor in defending ourselves against destructive criticism." The paper amplified UFA activities as well as activities of the United Farm Women of Alberta and Junior UFA. It raised discussions on natural resources, taxes, the Alberta wheat pool, government legislation and policy, rural issues such as education and farm safety, and broader articles on cooperation and the farmers' movement. While the UFA was in government, the publication was used to communicate their provincial platform, and at times their front page was devoted to what was going on in government with articles from UFA politicians. One of the UFA's most prolific leaders was Henry Wisewood, who became president of the UFA from 1916 to 1931. Henry Wisewood was a successful farmer in Missouri before moving to the Carstairs area in 1905. He was also president of the Canadian Council of Agriculture from 1917 to 1923 and president of the Alberta Wheat Pool from 1923 to 1937. Wood was a strong proponent of class organization, believing that it would enable cooperation and the ability to take economic and political action. He is credited with advancing the social and economic conditions of rural Albertans and was considered quite progressive for his time. Wood became known for being the most dynamic farm and social leader of his day, and he has even been referred to as the agrarian Moses. UFWA and UFA member Irene Parlby said of him, "I remember him so well at board meetings, sitting up at the end of the table, sometimes with his eyes shut, apparently taking no notice of what was going on or even being said by the various members. Then he would suddenly look up and very slowly and clearly sum up all the wordy speeches, bringing wisdom and logic to bear." When the UFA formed government in 1921, Wood declined the premiership, preferring to remain president. He was actually quite reluctant for the UFA to even enter politics in the first place, believing that their role as an advocacy group was the best way to push for government reform on farm matters. But he was outnumbered in this and realized that the membership was eager to try their hand at politics. So we're just going to take a bit of a detour before we come back to politics, just to talk about the United Farm Women of Alberta and the UFA's junior branch. In 1913, the UFA amended its constitution to admit women as members, and in the following year, a women's section was formed. But it was 1916 that the women members formed a separate organization known as the United Farm Women of Alberta, or the UFWA. The first UFA local was in Alex. The formation of the UFA had seen a new sense of community arise out of the shared experiences and common grievances, and farm women were looking to build community among themselves that would address the unique problems that they faced. An early UFWA pamphlet reads, "The monotony and isolation of farm life, with its consequent restricted opportunities for recreation, development, or service, was the despair of many a thinking woman." The UFWA was governed by the UFA Constitution and had member representation on the UFA Board of Directors. They also received an annual operating grant from the UFA for $500. And this is probably one of my favorite photos. It's a postcard, but it looks like a car dressed up for a parade, and it has a UFWA pendant on the front of it. One of the initiatives that the UFWA are known for is their cookbooks. The first cookbook was in 1928 from recipes donated by members from across the province. The recipes had ingredients that would have been readily available on Alberta farms, making items such as oatmeal cookies, potato rolls, and bran muffins. There were 8 subsequent editions with many more printings, and the book sold over 125,000 copies. The cookbook was so popular that they received requests from people all over Canada trying to obtain a copy. Inside, there were also advertisements for baking ingredients, an outline of the UFWA and its mission, and this recipe for farm cooperatives from the Alberta Wheat Pool. In our collection, we have UFWA cookbooks for 1930 and 1946, and they both show that they've been very well used. Once organized, the United Farm Women of Alberta quickly began pushing for improvements in public education, healthcare, community well-being, and equal rights, and became a primary voice for these issues in rural Alberta at this time. The UFWA locals brought their issues to UFA conventions, who in turn made resolutions to lobby the provincial government and push for better recognition for the unique matters that farmers faced. One area of importance being access to rural healthcare. Their advocacy led to the establishment of a Department of Public Health and increased health spending and recruitment of provincial healthcare nurses and doctors. They also brought greater awareness to mental health, transmittable diseases, and cancer detection. Like the famous 5, both the UFWA and the UFA lobbied the government for women's suffrage, which resulted in Alberta women gaining the right to vote on April 19, 1916. But this only saw legislation passed for some Alberta women, such as those who were married, Christian, and of European descent. Black, Indigenous, and Chinese women were still denied the right to vote in provincial elections. This taste for political freedom took hold among women in Alberta, and particularly UFWA members, some of whom pursued further involvement in politics. In the 1917 election, UFWA member Louise McKinney of Claresholm ran for the Nonpartisan League on a platform of prohibition and became the first woman elected to a Canadian legislature. UFWA member Irene Parlby won her riding in the Lacombe district and remained in this position for 14 years. Other UFA members became involved in constituency associations and assisted with campaigning. United Farm Women were leading the way into politics, which further carved out space for others to do the same. And members were at the forefront of these trailblazing fights for equality and community betterment, but there were prevalent attitudes, values, and policies that worked to restrict the rights of others. It was a 1921 report titled Mental Hygiene Survey of the Province of Alberta that really took a hold in the UFWA. This survey was used as justification for key members of the group, including Parley and McKinney, and UFA Ministers of Health, Richard Reid and George Hoadley, to push for eugenics legislation. Eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices aimed at controlling the breeding of the human population to weed out traits thought to be undesirable. Although Premier John E. Brown-Lee was reportedly reluctant to pass such a legislation, the UFWA gained public support for their campaign, and the Sexual Sterilization Act was passed by the UFA government in 1928. The version put forward by the UFA required patients to consent to being sterilized, but further amendments to this law after 1937 by the Social Credit Party did away with this. And the act remained in place until 1972 and saw more than 2,800 people, many of whom were Indigenous women, sterilized under its mandate. And while we don't have time to delve into the full impact this legislation has had, the Eugenics Archive fully covers this time in Alberta's history, and I'll put a link in the chat at the end of the presentation for you to explore further. The role of UFWA president has seen notable women hold this position, which has helped to guide the organization, including Irene Palby, Amy Warr, and Vera Lowe. In 1915, Parley helped establish the first UFWA local in Alex. The following year, she became their first president, and then in 1919 became the first woman officer of the UFA. She was elected to the provincial legislature in the UFA government and appointed cabinet minister without portfolio, becoming the first woman in Alberta to hold this position. Irene was passionate about healthcare and education, and she even helped to establish the local library in Alex. And she was also one of the famous five, the group of women who worked for suffrage, property rights, and the right for women to be legally judged as persons in Canada. Amy Warr of Wiskatino was a UFWA director from 1920 to 1933 and president from 1929 to 1933, being unanimously re-elected multiple times in her tenure. She fought hard for improving both health and education in Alberta by making them more accessible. And she was a skilled public speaker who addressed many problems during her time in leadership, including the economic situation of Alberta during the Great Depression. And Vera Lowe of Namao was the final president. She delivered radio broadcasts alongside the UFA president on several occasions, including one from October 1946, where she stated, "Make no mistake, the farm women are keenly interested in all problems tackled by men, such as markets, prices, railway rates, and so on, but factors that touch on home life each and every day, such as educational facilities, health services, and social conditions, form the basis of a study and action program for UFWA locals." And she oversaw the group's transition from Farm Women's Union to Farm Women's Union of Alberta in 1949, where she stayed on as president. The Junior UFA was formed in 1919, largely backed by the United Farmers Women of Alberta. UFWA president at the time said, "We need the enthusiasm of youth as much as the calm balance and wise judgment of age. The work of starting junior branches is difficult, but it is the most important thing our organization can take up. Unselfish service for the public good, high ideals of citizenship, and the qualities of leadership must all be learnt in youth." There was a clear realization that the survival of the UFA depended on Alberta's youth who would bring new ideas to the organization, and that future farm leaders should be trained while still young. UFA and UFWA members wanted to provide civic training that would lead to the eventual participation in the farmers' organization, and to teach the agrarian principles that were important to them. The Junior UFA operated with a similar constitution to the UFA, and its membership consisted of young people in their teens and early 20s. Members were taught agricultural and household skills, as well as leadership skills through debate and public speaking. Local chapters were located mainly in farming towns around Alberta, and by 1919, 20 Junior UFA locals had been organized, including at Consort and Okotoks. Locals tended to be quite active and organized activities for their members, including dances, grain judging contests, and some locals had their own band, as you can see in this news clipping here. The Junior UFA provided updates to the wider UFA membership in the UFA publication, and a delegate from each junior local was invited to the annual UFA convention. And like the UFWA, the junior president had a place on the UFA board of directors. Some past junior UFA members had long careers with the UFA, including Will Hoppins, who became UFA's general manager from 1951 to 1963, and Lawrence Proudfoot, who became manager of the UFA's Petroleum Division from 1964 to 1987. Upon the formation of the Farmers Union of Alberta in 1949, the organization became the Junior Farm Union of Alberta. And I love this group photo. The Junior UFA held annual conventions each year, which often coincided with Farm Young People's Week that began in 1917. This was an event sponsored by farm organizations, including the UFA, Alberta Wheat Pool, United Grain Growers, along with the Government of Alberta Department of Agriculture and the University of Alberta, to give young rural Albertans a taste of university life. So we're going to go back into politics now. The UFA, along with the UFWA, were considered successful advocacy groups. The UFA had worked with provincial government up until this point to implement important reforms, but several issues were still unaddressed. Farmers expressed their frustrations with being exploited despite the important work that they did in providing food for their communities. This discontent, compounded with the uncertainties coming out of the First World War and the influenza pandemic, set the stage for farmers to pursue political activity. In 1919, the UFA Annual Convention passed a resolution to allow its members to enter politics both provincially and federally. In 1921, Alberta Premier Charles Stewart knew he was rapidly losing popularity, and he called a snap election to try and catch opposing parties off guard, particularly the UFA, who had been gaining popularity. A provincial election was called for July 18, 1921, and this was just days after the federal by-election where UFA candidate Robert Gardner won a seat that easily placed him in Parliament. So I don't have time to delve into federal politics here, but we'll mention that in the 1921 federal election, the UFA ran candidates and won in all ridings, and UFA MPs continued to be elected up until 1935. On the 18th, voters turned out in droves and Premier Stewart's plan backfired. 38 UFA candidates had won in their ridings, securing 2/3 of the seats needed for the legislature. And pictured here is an item from our collection. It's the front page of the Western Farmer newspaper announcing the UFA's win. The first UFA premier was Herbert Greenfield, who was chosen as the leader quite reluctantly. And he had not actually ran in the election. The elected MLA for Peace River resigned his seat so that Greenfield could run unopposed in a by-election and then be eligible for the premiership. This photo was taken July of 1921 of UFA members-elect, and Greenfield isn't even in the photo because he hadn't been sworn in yet as premier. Once he was premier, Greenfield was immediately faced with several major issues, including the drought in southern Alberta, a farm debt crisis, and a much-needed reformation of the grain marketing system. Greenfield took on multiple roles and was also the provincial secretary, treasurer, and minister of municipal affairs. And his wife passed away early on in his tenure, which deeply affected him. The election win really had taken UFA candidates by surprise, many of whom were farmers themselves, and they were not expecting to form government. This ushered in an inexperienced cabinet and a party that was largely unprepared for their new role. The UFA government under Greenfield did manage to establish some significant reforms, including passing drought and debt relief bills, extending credit to farmer-owned cooperatives, helping to establish the Alberta Wheat Pool in 1923 to get fair prices for grain, and putting an end to the losing battle of prohibition. Greenfield governed until his resignation in 1925. Then John E. Brownlee stepped in for the interim. Brownlee was a lawyer and the Attorney General under Greenfield. He was elected in the Ponoka riding and was already a household name with farmers from being involved with the formation of the Alberta Farmers Cooperative Elevator Company and the United Grain Growers. He also worked alongside Greenfield in establishing the Alberta Wheat Pool. Brownlee's first strategy to get the government back on track was to increase its revenues. In January 1926, he set off to Ottawa to see Prime Minister Mackenzie King to negotiate the transfer of resource and land control back to Alberta. This was a goal that Brownlee had worked towards back in his days as Attorney General when he proclaimed in 1922 that the natural resources question was one of the biggest problems in the province to date. Brownlee then accomplished what no government before him had been able to do, and a deal to transfer resource control to Alberta was finalized by 1929. In addition, he and the Minister of Railways made a deal to purchase a majority stake in the Edmonton-Dunvegan and British Columbia Railway, allowing the province to then negotiate the sale of it for millions. Under Brownlee, the UFA government announced a budget surplus of $188,000, and it was the second largest in Alberta's history at this time. The provincial election of 1926 saw the UFA gain even more votes than the 1921 election, winning 43 seats, and Brownlee easily secured his premiership. But then came the Great Depression. The price of wheat fell, financial systems worldwide were heavily impacted, and unemployment soared. In June of 1930, another election was called, and Brownlee knew he needed the support of his government and the people to get through these tough economic times. The UFA won enough seats to form government for the third time, but they had less support than their previous campaigns, even losing some of their rural ridings to other parties. And Brownlee's premiership struggled during the Great Depression. He had trouble negotiating federal assistance from Prime Minister and fellow Albertan R.B. Bennett. He was forced to disband the Alberta Provincial Police, and he even had to disconnect the electric elevator in the legislature building. Times were tough. Brownlee was not in favor of instituting widespread government relief programs, but instead wanted to shield the government from financial ruin, prompting calls from citizens that the government was not doing enough to help its people. And it appeared as if things could not get any worse for the UFA government, but for Brownlee in particular, the worst was yet to come. In September of 1933, a civil suit was filed against Brownlee for seducing 18-year-old Vivian McMillan, a family friend and stenographer working in the provincial government. Brownlee, married to his wife Florence for 21 years, denied the accusation and pushed back against the claims that he had been leading a double life. But the rumors persisted and the damage was swift. Albertans did not want their premier caught up in such a scandal. And with the government's popularity already on shaky ground from years of deep economic strife, John E. Brownlee resigned on July 10, 1934. Franklin L. Foster, who has written extensively about Brownlee's life, notes that the controversy had the makings of a liberal smear campaign all over it, as McMillan's lawyer reportedly had a personal vendetta against Brownlee dating back to his term as Attorney General. While Brownlee is often known for his scandal that caused both his and the UFA government's downfall, he fulfilled some pretty significant accomplishments, notably the transfer of mineral rights to the province, which has continued to benefit Albertans to this day. He also sat on the Royal Commission on Banking and Currency to assess if Canada should have its own central bank, which is now which formed the basis of what we know as the Bank of Canada. And in addition, Brownlee jump-started the creation of the provincial park system with the Provincial Parks and Protected Areas Act passed by the Alberta Legislature in 1930. So here's a few front covers from the UFA. The first is announcing the 1926 election win, and the second shows the government's budget surplus under Brownlee. And the third cover is a political pamphlet for the 1930 election. The inside pages outline the UFA government's record of achievements on social services, highways, and financial policies. After Brownlee's resignation, Richard Reid became the leader of the UFA government and Alberta's next premier. Reid was known for his prudent cost-cutting measures. He thought the publicly owned Alberta government telephones was too expensive and encouraged hundreds of private rural companies to purchase lines, easing the burden off of the government. But with the rise of the social credit and their enticement of $25 a month for every adult in Alberta, Richard Reid was no match for William Aberhart. Aberhart addressed the UFA at their 1935 annual convention in hopes of convincing them to back social credit theory, but the UFA was not swayed. Instead, the parties went head-to-head in the 1935 election, which didn't see a single UFA candidate elected federally or provincially, and William Aberhart became Alberta's next premier. The UFA governed from 1921 to 1935, and this period proved to be a tumultuous time to be in government. Decades later, in an oral history interview just prior to his death, Brownlee stated, "Unquestionably, the greatest single strain upon the UFA government during this time developed from the problems arising out of the Great Depression." He went on to say that it must be remembered that the last election was fought under the worst conditions that Canada's had in 100 years. The farmers were just simply desperate. There can't be any doubt at all that an awful lot of the UFA membership throughout the province had changed to support Aberhart. Undoubtedly, the UFA government saw its fair share of turmoil, largely out of its control, which included managing the impacts of the flu, First World War, and the years of economic and agricultural hardship from the Great Depression. When reflecting on UFA's time in politics, former director and UFA Central Co-op manager Norman Priestley noted that the farm organization had suffered a terrible blow, none would deny, but it was not fatal. It gives us a chance to start again. Priestley drew attention to the fact that the UFA was already well established in rural communities. Decades-long relationships remained with members of the wheat pool and United Grain Growers, and people were not going to discard years of joint action and agricultural progress over political differences. Years later, at the 1939 annual convention, resolution number 49 was put forward stating, "Be it resolved that the board of the UFA recommend to this convention that we cease all our direct political activity, and further, that no individual, local, or association be allowed in any circumstance whatsoever to use any part of the UFA machinery to endorse or promote the interests of a political party or movement." The decision to never enter politics again was passed by a large majority, and the resolution has stood to this day. After the exit from politics, the UFA saw their membership decrease and locals start to disappear. This was a chance for anew, and UFA's leadership turned their focus to commercial endeavors. Back in 1932, the UFA Central Cooperative Association was incorporated as a subsidiary of the UFA for the purposes of coordinating wholesaling and marketing. By 1940, the co-op established a central office, warehouse, and retail outlet in Calgary. Within a few years, they had sufficient capital to operate a network of hardware and grocery stores and service stations with a presence in several regions of Alberta. In 1946, the name was changed to United Farmers of Alberta Cooperative Association Limited and amended its bylaws to permit it to function as a cooperative wholesaler, distributor, and marketing organization. And this is more aligned with what we know today as the UFA. The UFA then concentrated its efforts into two areas: petroleum products and farm supplies. The 1909 United Farmers of Alberta and the Alberta Farmers Union merged in 1948, which created the Farmers Union of Alberta, and they continued to the work of advocating for farmers' interests and for cooperative organization. And so this is a photo of the UFA Central Co-op head office in Calgary. And this was the first headquarters that was actually owned by the UFA, and it opened in 1940. Prior to this, the UFA's operations had been out of the Lougheed building, which was shared with the United Grain Growers. And so this new building was strategically located on the edge of the city with easier access to highways, railroads, and freight facilities. And in addition to the office space, the building also had a UFA retail store and a petroleum service station on the same lot. In 1935, the UFA first began its partnership with Maple Leaf Petroleum, a subsidiary of Imperial Oil, for Maple Leaf to market gasoline and petroleum products to UFA members through rural service stations. In 1953, UFA acquired Maple Leaf, a visionary move that helped to secure the co-op's economic future. UFA purchased the entire assets of Maple Leaf for $1 million, and a version of the Maple Leaf logo and brand continued to be used on UFA products up until the 1970s. The UFA professionalized their petroleum division and hired capable field petroleum supervisors to transform their patchwork of fuel outlets into a well-run network of fuel suppliers. The oil boom into the 70s saw agencies spring up in country towns all over the province, some with added tire shops and mechanics garages. UFA fuel agents were entrepreneurs, many who have now created generational businesses passed on to their family members. And of course, today there are UFA petroleum agencies all over Alberta and in BC and Saskatchewan. And so here's the UFA head office that was used from 1958 to 1976. And during this time, UFA's commercial sales had tripled and their administrative staff grew to accommodate this growth. And it was also found that the building had become too small to house the printing, stationery, and massive data processing equipment that had become more widely used in the 70s. The UFA Farm Supply Division entered the retail market in 1954, opening its first farm and ranch supply store in Calgary that same year. And by the end of the year, their sales had totaled over $850,000. Robert Milton McCool, who you can see on the left here, he was the manager of the first store and traveled the province organizing other UFA farm store branches. And McCool had a long career with the UFA. He was an MLA under the UFA government in the Cochrane district from 1926 until 1935. And then you can see the first UFA farm store in Calgary on the right. The increased demand on UFA's farm supply division justified opening a new farm store in Edmonton in 1957, a location that would better serve the needs of producers in the northern areas of the province. By 1960, farmers had become more industrialized and specialized, with the demand growing for more accessible farm supplies in rural areas. The UFA saw this need and in 1964 opened their first rural farm stores at Vermilion, Camrose, and Grimshaw, with many more to open in the years to come. UFA's petroleum and farm supply divisions continued to play important roles in the expansion and success of the UFA. The 1960s saw rapid growth and many new stores were added to the family. The 70s saw a steady increase in the mechanization of agriculture and fuel consumption, and this led to new agreements with the UFA Petroleum Division to handle all of its petroleum business from refinery to agencies. Edmonton became the location for UFA's distribution center in 1976. And was the main depot for farm supply stores and petroleum agencies throughout Alberta. And that same year, a new two-story head office opened in Calgary to better accommodate their growing membership and workforce. And so on the left, you can actually see the data room here in 1982, and it's one of my most favorite photos. 1984 was the opening of UFA's first card lock, a 24-hour automated fuel station, which became a network that continued to grow to be the largest of its kind in Alberta. And this period also saw the introduction of the orange farm stores and agencies, a color that was soon synonymous with UFA. And while there's no concrete explanation as to why this color was chosen, it has served a practical purpose. When looking for the nearest UFA in town, you just look for the brightest building. And so here's a photo of the agency at Medicine Hat, where you can see the very bright orange exterior. Farm supply stores proved to be popular, and UFA received requests from towns all over Alberta wanting their own UFA. But the 1980s saw high interest rates, inventory, land, and building costs that made it harder to justify new facilities. Additionally, a drought in 1984 and 1985 made for a series of financially difficult years. When times were challenging for farmers, they were too for the UFA. Despite this, the UFA did open a new farm store in Strathmore in 1985, and pictured here are employees, some from neighboring farm stores and from head office that all came to help out with the grand opening. And I like this photo because all of the staff members just huddled around the counter. Reminds me of my own time in retail. In 1984, the UFA celebrated its 75th anniversary with a commemorative logo and a special slogan for the year, which was 75 years progressing with agriculture. And there was merchandise giveaways and even a coloring contest with the grand prize of a trip to Australia. And so here's a cover of the United Farmer to commemorate the occasion. And the United Farmer was published by the UFA out of their head office from 1967 to 1985. And it even won publication awards for the work that they did. The longevity of the UFA is credited to savvy leaders the organization has seen over the years, such as George Church, George Sale, Jim Schindler, Bill McCartney, Howard Haney, Jerry Metz, Terry Semenek, and many others, as well as the members who have sustained and supported the cooperative model for all these years. McCartney, who you can see seated in the middle of this photo just off to the right, would oversee 20 years of unprecedented growth from 1964 to 1984 that transformed the UFA into a modern business. Under McCartney in 1966 was also the transition from the long-standing tradition of the UFA local to a delegate advisory committee, where elected delegates from the area became the intermediary between the UFA and its members. Board President Howard Haney brought the UFA into the technology age with the introduction of a computerized retail system. And CEO Terry Semenek focused on employee satisfaction and customer service, even doing away with the stuffy term head office, which instead became the Calgary Support Office, which it is still known as today. A number of milestones have occurred just in the past 2 decades as well. In 2004, the revenue hit $1 billion for the first time and surpassed $2 billion just 7 years later, which has directly benefited the organization's over 120,000 member owners. In 2009, UFA celebrated a century of serving agricultural producers, and a commemorative history book was published called Deep Roots, Promising Future, and this is available digitally on our website for you to see. Community investment has become a key focus, with UFA-sponsored sports teams, rodeo and industry events, 4-H, rural farm safety initiatives, and scholarships. 2016 named Carol Kitchen as UFA's new CEO, making her the first female to lead a large agricultural cooperative in North America. And in 2022, UFA was named one of Alberta's top 75 employers for the 10th year in a row. Today, the UFA is known for its iconic orange farm stores and petroleum agencies, but its early history is an organization aimed at representing and promoting the interests of farmers in the rural communities of Alberta. While the UFA may look different today, the organization's origins show how integral it is to Alberta's history. The UFA was originally founded on giving a voice to farmers, and many of the same principles remain, such as advocating for farmers' interests and highlighting the value that they bring to their communities. Looking back a century ago, we remember the impact this significant agrarian movement has had on our province and country. And so here's my reference list, and the images used in this presentation are all from our archives. And so if you have any questions about my sources or the pictures, please feel free to contact me. And so just a little bit about the United Farmers Historical Society. We're a nonprofit organization formed in 2002 with the purpose of preserving and celebrating the rich history of UFA. There's 5 board members, a UFA board representative, and 1 full-time archivist, that's me. And we also currently have a summer student working on a photo digitization project. The archives holds UFA-related records from 1909 to the present, and associated records from the Farmers Union of Alberta, United Grain Growers, Alberta Wheat Pool, and others. We house over 35 meters of textual records, 7,000 photographs and slides, numerous audio and video recordings, UFA publications, an artifact collection, and a library. We are a recognized institutional member of the Archives Society of Alberta, and the archives is open to the public by appointment for researchers to access records and information in person. And we're located in Calgary across from the Mount Royal University. And we also provide virtual research services too. Yeah. So I do have some links and I'll just put them in the chat here for everyone. It has my email, our social media, and a link to our blog as well.